game theory is not just theory. Game theory is the operating system of interactions, collaboration, and competition. It gives you a working map of how those elements work in your business and how those dynamics play out in your context. One of the things that you will learn first in game theory is that every decision that you make shapes outcomes, which then causes other players to respond to your move, to your decisions, to these outcomes. So you never act in isolation. You're always part of an ecosystem. You deal with an ecosystem with interdependencies. Business is a multiplayer game. You have competitors, you have regulators, you have vendors, employees, customers, you have the public, you have government, you have all kinds of players that in one way or another interact with your business. You can also call them stakeholders, right? And so those players have their own interests, their own motivations. And you can either play a zero-sum game where you go for short-term wins and knock out one after the other, and you treat each interaction as a life or death situation where you need to crush your enemies and use metaphors of strife and conflict. Or you can actually look at the bigger picture, the long-term view, the long-term game, and see how you strategically position yourself, how you collaborate with the different players, and how you create desired outcomes for yourself primarily, but then also for those other players. Because in game theory, and again, game theory might fall short using this term, it's not something abstract. With a lens of game theory, I look at my reputation as the strategy, as part of the strategy. My reputation as, for example, being known as being trustworthy, as being reliable, as being collaborative, actually increases my options in the mid and long term, because more people will want to collaborate with me and will want to give me opportunities, whereas I also pay that forward and give them opportunities. So if, on the other hand, my reputation is great, aggressive person, killed it, crushed it, did that deal, hit 150% sales, but at great expense, reputational expense, in terms of being now seen as somebody unreliable, somebody predatory, somebody unethical, that actually reduces my options in the mid and long term. Because other players will be way more on guard with me, will be way less willing to collaborate and cooperate with me, and will defend themselves against me, and might build even alliances against me because they would see me as a threat. So the lens of game theory helps us to understand that we play a long-term game, and we move out of the predatory worldview or predatory operating system that's sometimes celebrated in society, sometimes celebrated in certain cultures even, and it is being glorified to be somebody who is ruthless, to be somebody who walks over dead bodies to achieve their goals, who doesn't care, who is unethical but successful, lives in a great house, has 3 cars, and amazing, right? Like you can certainly think of many archetypes that have been and are still being widely celebrated, despite their criminality and their lack of ethics. So we have a part of the culture that celebrates those very corrupt values, but in reality and in most cases, that's not good for business. Like, it will not help you in your industry to be known as somebody who screws other people over. Of course, you can always gain short-term advantages. You can always take over in the short term. You can be very successful even in the short term with those ruthless tactics. But the problem is, as you're part of that ecosystem, it will haunt you later on. There will be a point when you need, for some reason or another, the collaboration, cooperation of somebody else, and you might not get it because of these actions further upstream. So every single move that we make as leaders, as companies, causes counter moves. It changes the reality, right? And I always like to say, in environments where you have many unknowns, so-called VUCA environments, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, when you have many unknowns, right, you need to literally negotiate with reality. Like, you need to take action, test reality, see what happens, what comes back, what other moves the other players are going to do, then iterate quickly, right, adjust your actions, take new actions, based on that new information, that new feedback, that new knowledge that you get, and iterate and iterate and iterate and approximate towards the desired outcomes where you want to go. This is very different from creating a 5-year linear plan. Like in year 1 we do this, in year 2 we do this, in year 3 we do this, and with certain assumptions about things that will not change. But the reality is a lot of things are always changing. And there are certainly some industries and some professions. If I build a building, like a high-rise building, it's probably quite predictable. If I have the financing secured and the permissions, the permits secured, it's probably quite predictable what will happen over the next 5 years. And I have a year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5 plan. And there's probably very little disruption or variation. That's a bit more of a linear game. But most business environments are non-linear games. That means they're all over the place. From today to tomorrow, there could be a new regulation. There can be a change in the market, a new technology. A new competitor comes in with venture capital funding and takes over the market and takes away all the existing customers. There are many things that you cannot predict. Business environments are inherently unstable, volatile, and you can, of course, always give it your best shot at creating a working map of reality, of anticipating. Anticipating, of course, is part of your responsibility, but you also have to understand there will be many things that you will not know. There will always be unknowns. So we also need to understand that we have long-term directions, we have long-term outcomes that we pursue, but the how of getting there sometimes is quite flexible. Like we take our best estimate of what we think will work, we test it out by try and error, and we immediately and instantly reiterate and upgrade and improve our actions to get closer to the outcomes that we want. And it requires feedback loops. When we say feedback loops, that also means implicitly we get information about context. So the old ivory tower mentality or ivory tower operation system doesn't work here, which means I'm the CEO. I hang out with my other leaders who all have a certain college education, who all went to the same school, who all like the same pastime activities, and meet each Thursday for dinner in an expensive restaurant and go golfing on the weekends. Like this type of ivory mentality, ivory tower operating system is typically where some of the worst decisions are originating, because those types of groups lose contact with reality. And it's often, of course, you can always bridge gaps with external consultants, with market research and whatnot. But honestly, having been someone who has seen a lot of that type of market research, I would still argue that it still leaves a lot of gaps open when somebody comes in to do this. And there will still be massive context gaps. And often those ivory tower leaders also lose completely the connection to the mid-level management and the ground level and the actual market, what is happening, the anecdotal context. They might think, okay, it's not the job of top management to be concerned about those things. Of course, it's not the job of top management to take decisions on that level. It's not the job to get involved and to give your opinion about everything. But it is your job to know, to understand the context that you are in, the ecosystem that you're in. Because you are taking the decisions for the company. You're directing all of these people and those organizational resources. And if you are blind about your environment, if you are blind about potential counter moves by the other players, if you're blind about who the actual players even are, if you're blind about all of those things, you will act in isolation and your moves can actually backfire against you. And so game theory really operates as it is an operating system. It is a way of seeing the world. It is a way of seeing business, especially in environments that are non-linear. And ultimately, it is also about, stop being a piece on the board, but instead becoming an architect of the board. I'll give you a quick example. I often run into situations with clients where we look at the go-to-market engine, where we look at the revenue organization that is typically marketing, sales, and customer success or account management. So pre-sales, sales, after sales. And what we often find is those three departments, if they are in a mid-sized company or mid-market company, they typically have already department heads or directors and probably quite sizable teams. And they're typically just banging their heads against each other and pulling each other's hair out because they're in constant conflict and friction with each other. And then I often find it is being framed as a personality conflict, or oh, these are just difficult, strong-willed leaders. It's not at all. It's the incentive structure. And through a game theory lens, we also understand that people typically, not always, but typically most of the time, act in their own interest based on the incentives that are given to them. If you show and demonstrate in your company many times that the sleazy, manipulative politician employee gets promoted and gets salary raises because they play golf with the CEO on the weekend, then you created an incentive structure that now signals to everybody else, this is the way to get incentivized, to get rewarded. I should probably adopt this behavior as well. To, of course, is a huge distraction from actual business outcomes. And so in marketing, sales, and customer success, you see similar things. Often incentives are set up. Marketing create as much volume and leads as possible. Sales make as much revenue and sales as possible. Customer success deal with the fallout. And that's when you see all those clashes. Sales is unhappy with the quality of leads. Marketing thinks that sales doesn't appreciate their competence and what they're doing. Customer success is frustrated, and probably all the leaders have already resigned, so there typically isn't even a leader anymore left to argue. And is in a reactive posture where they're just being customer support, far away from upselling, retention, and renewals, and actually creating expansion revenue for the company, recurring revenue for the company. And so then you start rebuilding the incentives. You say, marketing now gets incentivized for the conversion rate of sales. So if sales can convert those leads that you bring in, then marketing gets their bonus. Sales now gets incentivized for how long are those customers staying. So if customer success does a great job in terms, if those customers that came in had a lot of potential in order to stay longer because proper relationships had been built by sales, the tone had been set properly, there's been honesty, there had been collaborative and respectful interactions with the customers, of course the customers want to stay. They want to buy again. And so you change the incentive structure like this, and suddenly people work together naturally. Like marketing people seek out the counsel of sales in order to understand better what sales is learning through all of these conversations. Sales now actively reaches out to customer success because they know that they will get more money if those customers stay. And so now they give them as much information as possible to ensure a successful onboarding and so forth. So instead of seeing what's happening in your company and organization as personality clashes and just difficult people and what can you do about it, you have to think of it as incentive structures. People act based on how the board game has been designed. And it's too often for leaders to throw their hands up in the air and say, well, I'm a businessman. I don't know about structures, about organizational design. I'm just here to make the money. I would say there's a bit of a lazy excuse. Like, if you're in charge of the company, if you're in charge of the organization, right, you are also the one who takes the decisions of the shape and form and future of that organization. And if there's a skill gap, you can still bring in people to do this, or you can empower people inside your company that you know has the skill sets and start wrapping your mind around it. Because an organization is ultimately a summary, it is a conglomerate of agreements, of contracts, implied contracts, explicit contracts, the contract that I call you CEO and in return I get a certain amount of money transferred to my bank account every month. It's all agreements and contracts in a nutshell, like on the most foundational level. And so as the organizational leader, it is also your role to shape those, to shape what the structure, the almost the psychological structure, the incentive structure, the board game structure of the company looks like. And if you see a process, that doesn't mean it's set in stone. Doesn't mean that it's sacrosanct and you cannot touch it. Processes can be changed. Processes are ultimately agreements between people. They're verbal, implied, written contracts in a nutshell. And those can be changed. Those can be renegotiated. Here's a new contract. Here's a new agreement of how we run things, of how we do things. And so it's often considered like as if it was witchcraft, as if it was something that was beyond the capability. But it is obviously mystified for a reason, because some consultants thrive on then coming in and doing these things for leaders who feel overwhelmed with it. But honestly, a leader can do this as well by just demystifying what this actually is. It is ultimately about agreements between people, and those agreements include the incentives. These agreements also include understanding what is going on so that you can make sensible decisions. And ideally, of course, your department heads can make those decisions. But if they're in clinch with each other, you need to have a higher instance that actually redesigns the game for them, that has the authority to redesign the incentive structure for them. Otherwise, you will just run an organization that is set up against each other. And in terms of the game theory lens, that just means you will be more busy with yourself, you'll be more busy with your internal chaos, and you will by default be blind to your environment. And your market moves, right, will cause reactions by other players that you cannot foresee because you're not on the pulse of the market, you're not on the pulse of the industry. So ultimately, it's all about moving out of a disempowered posture where you see external reality as somewhat of an objective, non-changeable, non-moving thing that you are kind of passively a victim of, a structural victim of. Reality is shapeable. Reality is fluid. Reality changes. And you want to assume a posture and an operating system that actually allows you to take advantage and to leverage that fluidity of reality and to see reality, including your organizational context and the outer environment, as an ecosystem with interdependent relationships, with where every decision that you make causes different reactions and responses, where it's a multiplayer game, where you need to widen your lens to be on the pulse of the context of what's going on so you can make proper moves. And once you get feedback from those moves, you can iterate quickly to approximate and get closer and iterate towards your desired outcomes. And it's a very different way of thinking and of operating compared to the linear models that we typically hear and that are available in business schools. But in a world in which change becomes the new normal, I would argue it's the only operating model that is a working version for dealing with all of this change, dealing with all of this chaos, dealing with all of those disruptions, and still staying in control.